Welcome to the This Is His Story podcast, the executive director and pastor guide to sowing and reaping online givers. Today, we want to be encouraged and enlightened by listening to a special interview. This Is His Story podcast focuses on ministry backstories of people God is using for his kingdom work and those pouring out God's grace to hurting people around the globe. From Bible teachers to counselors to those that feed the hungry, pull people from dark places, and missionaries, we look into the events, personalities, callings, and circumstances of those God is using as his hands and feet.
Hello and welcome to This Is His Story podcast. I'm Todd Turner, and my special guest today is Jim Sheppard, CEO and Principal of Generis. Welcome, Jim.
Hey, Todd. Good to be here with you today, brother.
Man, I'm so excited. I got to be honest. You and I are friends. I've known you for a couple of years, and I've had meals with you, but I haven't really got to pick your brain on your life story. And I certainly have worked with you enough to know your passion about what you do. And so I want to learn about you as a person, and I also want to learn more about your career, your passion, and your ministry within your career. So, man, I've been thinking about this for weeks.
I'm glad to be here, brother. Glad to have a chance to tell my story and let people hear some things that maybe they've assumed about me, may have heard bits and pieces, but they'll hear a lot more of it today.
Man, well, let's start with just the plain and simple. Like, where were you born? Tell me about your childhood rearing, your family life. Just backtrack a couple of years here.
Yeah, so I was born in Georgia, lived all of my life in Georgia, but I was born way down I-75, almost to Florida, a little town called Tifton, Georgia. And my mom and dad were from South Georgia, and my dad was a banker down there. And when I was 2 years old, I don't remember it, so I'm relying on my mom and dad's version of this. He got a promotion to another bank in Augusta, Georgia, and we moved there. There's a little clue to where I grew up, right there, the Masters Golf Tournament, that little community event that they had there every April. So really, my home is Augusta. That's where I grew up from the time I was 2 until, I went to college, and even some after I was in college. That's where I grew up. I have a younger brother, Steve. He's 2.5 years younger than I am, and it's just the two of us. Had a great mom and dad, brother. I'm telling you, I tell people today, and I realize the more and more, the older I get, the more I realize this is not the norm. I've never been to bed a day in my life that I doubted the love of my mom and dad. Never. I've never spent a second of my life. I've spent some time wondering whether they were mad at me. That's a whole other issue.
It's a whole other topic.
Even when we were going through that, Todd, even when my dad was administering punishment, whether it was corporal, which was rare, but if it happened, you definitely remembered it, or whatever it was, I've never doubted the love of my mom and dad. So I was raised in a very stable family. My dad was a banker. My mom was a housewife. My mom were very faithful members of the Methodist Church there in Augusta. St. Mark is where I grew up, just right down the road from the Augusta National. I was confirmed into the membership of the church when I was 7th grade. But I would say to you and to everyone listening here, and looking back, it's clear to me I didn't have a relationship with Christ. I was following more of an obligatory family expectation than I was into a personal relationship with Christ. I was a pretty natural student. I didn't have to study real hard. And I made pretty good grades. Education came pretty easy to me until I got to junior high school. That was transformational. But even I adjusted to that and became a pretty good student through there. And I like to tell people, like, hey, so my mom, her undergraduate was English education, and she had a master's in English education. People asked me, they said, you seem to have a pretty good command of the language. And I was like, well, yeah, it's because I got it at school and at home. I mean, we couldn't use bad grammar at the dinner table. I mean, for gosh sakes, you'd be called down for that. How many times I've told you the object of a participle is never the nominative, it's always the objective.
No double negatives. No, you knew how to
dangling participles. I mean, you couldn't do that stuff even at the dinner table. You're just kind of talking, hey, what happened to football practice today? You're my mom. So, but grateful for that, man. And yes. I'll tell you when I was really grateful, when I sat for the SAT, and they threw that verbal at me, man, I mastered that because I was getting it at school and at home.
That's awesome.
So it's a natural student. But here's the part of my life, and we'll kind of cut this short because it leads to some other things. But I was a rebel, man. I just, I knew inside of me that I was just a bit of a rebel. In spite of my mom and dad's love for me, that I wanted to pursue some things that were not healthy for me. I started hanging with the wrong crowd, started smoking cigarettes when I was 15, started drinking beer, started smoking marijuana, and then that, of course, led to other things. Anybody who says today that one of those is not the gateway to other things, I can tell you, maybe not for everybody, but it was for me. Because every one of those, when you get to this and that no longer satisfies, then you got to find something else above that. And, I ended up taking pills that I didn't know where they came from and just doing stupid things to my life and my body. And so, my mom and dad put up with that and still loved me unconditionally. I could tell you a couple of stories, one of which is, my dad treated me like the prodigal son. He put the ring and the robe on, when I'd gone through a very, very difficult time for them and for me. And so when I read Luke 15 today, I was like, yeah, my dad did that for me one time. I came to myself and came back to my house, and my dad greeted me like that. So I knew those things, but I was still a rebel, man. And went off to the University of Georgia. And now that you're not living in your parents' home, you've got a lot more freedom to do all the dumb stuff that you're doing, and you do a lot more of it.
Yeah.
But the whole script for my life flipped on 3 days after my birthday, after my freshman year. So I turned 19 on July 12th, 1973, and my father died very suddenly on July 15th, 1973. Wrecked me, man. Wrecked me. And just, looking back now, I can see the vastness of the wreck that it caused in my life. Because of all the things that you have as a teenage kid in your life script, none of those things include your parent dying very suddenly. No. It was a massive heart attack. My mom and dad grew up in South Georgia where, it was really, North Carolina was more of it later on, but that was the tobacco capital of the South. And so they didn't think smoking harmed him. My dad smoked 2-3 packs of cigarettes a day, which very obviously contributed to his death. May not have been the only factor, but, so there was that. But I was there. So there I was. Just think about this, Todd. Here I am, and I'm 19 years old. And I don't have a relationship with my Heavenly Father. Clearly don't have that, despite the fact that I was a member of St. Mark's United Methodist Church. And I don't have my earthly father. And the rest of my life takes shape around that day, July 15th, 1973, because everything that happens thereafter, I can pin almost everything in my life back to something that happened directly or indirectly from that day. So for me, the next 9 years of my life were just lived out in just anger. Some of it internal, some of it external that you could see, but mainly anger at God. I was never an agnostic. I didn't doubt the existence of God. My state was, in a lot of ways, Todd, was worse than being an atheist. I knew he existed. I knew he was a God of love and a God of might and a God of power. I had an incredible Sunday school teacher. So in terms of the head knowledge about God, I didn't lack that. Here's where it was. I didn't think he gave a rip about me. And that's probably, in its own way, that's worse than unbelief, because you think he cares about other people and he doesn't give a rip about you. But here's the thing, man. Even back then, and I can see it now, his hand, his providential sovereign hand was working in my life even when I didn't know it, And one of the primary ways of that is that he put Nancy into my life. Back then, and even now, people would say, y'all are a little bit of an odd couple, aren't you? Well, yeah. I mean, her started with a blind date, by the way, as I like to say, University of Georgia. So I stayed home from my sophomore year there. I stayed home with my mom. My mom was 44 years old and a widow. I had a younger brother. I was now the head of the family for all intents and purposes. And so I stayed home, went to Augusta College for a year, and then I returned to the University of Georgia after that. And that's when I met Nancy. And it was a blind date, as I like to say. She was blind and I needed a date. And that's how it worked out.
That's a great line.
Pretty good blind date. But lots of people in her sorority knew me. And even after she went out with me and said she had a good time, they were like, what?
Not
You
that guy.
had a good time with him? And so, I tell people today, it's the evidence of God's sovereign hand. I don't know that we would have absolutely picked each other had not God done that.
Yeah.
And we didn't know that at the time. We thought we picked each other. But in looking back, you can just see all of these things. Even later on, when you do compatibility tests, we would be the couple that would go into premarital counseling and someone would say, why are y'all getting married?
Right.
You don't have a chance. 42 years later, we've made it work.
Wow.
Because, Nancy has her world and I have my world, and then we have our world.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of the keys to success.
Was she a believer before you were?
No.
Okay.
She was same thing. Now, this is a really good way of looking at this too, because lots of our friends knew both of us back then, pre conversion, which I'll get to in just a minute. But we both came to Christ at the same time, right? Okay. Nancy was just a nice girl, a nice moral person. And I was not. As one friend of mine who knew us back then said, hey, so back then when Jim and Nancy were, back in the days where Jim was going, did you know that, that he's, and my one buddy, he's like, with Nancy, you weren't really sure whether she was a believer or not, because she was really nice. With Jim, no doubt.
No doubt.
He was not a believer. You know me well enough to know that's no surprise. I mean, for me, it's what you see on the outside, probably what's going on the inside. There's not much hiding, right? So, but the kindness and the graciousness of God and the sovereign providential hand of God was at work in my life for those 9 years, even in ways that I didn't. I graduated from college, got a great job, passed the CPA exam. I mean, my whole background is accounting and finance. Mm-hmm. That's what I came out of college to do.
And you knew that's the way you wanted to aim from the get-go, or you just made that decision?
No, I started off when I went to the University of Georgia, I was going to be a lawyer.
Okay.
And Nancy, sometimes now when we're debating back and forth, you can call it arguing. We call it healthy debates within our family. She'll just give up, and she's like, "You should have been a lawyer. You should have been a lawyer."
That's funny.
It is funny, because I could have been, but I just got sidetracked, and really the whole idea of money and finance, because my dad was a banker, both of my grandfathers were bankers. I was intrigued with money and finance, but not from the banking side. It was more the accounting side that got me, even though I passed the CPA exam, but I never went into public accounting. I was working in, corporate finance. Mm-hmm. Had a great job. Nancy and I got married, and it was about 3.5 years later. Nancy was a flight attendant for Delta Airlines. So for us, we were young marrieds with no kids. I had a good career. And Todd, we were free, man. We weren't believers. We weren't tethered to a church. We weren't tethered to anything. So it wouldn't be unlike us. This is, let's just say it's a Friday morning. And I just called Nancy up like, hey, what do you want to do this weekend? I don't know. Hey, let's go to New Orleans. Good. Let's get a pass and we'll go to New Orleans. We just fly to New Orleans. We'd go down there and, hang out on Bourbon Street. And, even back then we were foodies. We like to go to all the great restaurants, and we'd come back home on Sunday night and go to work on Monday morning. Okay. Hey, you want to go to Key West for the weekend? Yeah, let's go to Key West for the weekend. Hey, let's go to San Francisco for the weekend. I mean, that's just what we would do, man. And so in our minds, we were just like, we're going to do that because when we have kids, we won't have all this freedom. Mm-hmm. It's when we have kids. It's not if we have kids. It's when we have kids, right?
Knew the day was coming.
So our journey, so this is another one of those flip the script moments. It's another one of those transformational moments in our lives. We were kind of living that out, and I was sitting at my desk. I worked at 14th and Peachtree in downtown Atlanta. There's a big office tower there now, but National Service Industries was a company I work with now. Got a call on a late Wednesday afternoon, about 4:00 in the afternoon. It's Nancy. She's at her doctor's office, and she's crying, and she says, hey, I need you to come over here. It's like, what's up? She said, well, Dr. Hendig's found something, and we need to talk about it. And I was like, can you tell me? No, just come on over here. So that's all I knew. Mm. And obviously, I'm pretty upset, and I'm thinking, you know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking, cancer. Mm-hmm. Good news is from my office to Emory, where his office was, about 12 minutes. So I could get there pretty fast. I knew where his office was. I went, got parked, walked in. There's Nancy. She's crying. Dr. Hendy walks in. And he said, hey, thanks for coming over. I think this is a good time for us to talk. And I was like, what's going on? He goes up to the wall. We didn't have, MRIs and CAT scans back then. We had ultrasound. This was 1982. So this is 82. October, November 82. So he flips on the screen, Todd, and he says, and I don't know what I'm looking at. No. And there's all these white spots in there. And he said, well, that's Nancy. He said, that's a shot of right here in her abdominal section. I was like, what's going on? I said, are we talking cancer? He said, no, probably not. He said, it doesn't look like cancer. He said, but he said, I do suspect it's probably endometriosis. Well, let me tell you something, Todd. I didn't even know. I couldn't even pronounce the word when he said it, much less knew what it was. I mean, females obviously know what that is, but I didn't know what that was. And very quickly, what I came to understand was it was so widespread that the most likely scenario was a hysterectomy, which means the death of a dream. Yeah. So it's no longer when we have kids; it's if we have kids, and we may not. So we broke down right there, both cried right there, in his office. And we was like, okay, doc, let's just go ahead and take care of this as soon as we can. So we scheduled the surgery for about 4 weeks later. I'll tell you this, Todd. I mean, for that 4 weeks, every time we went into any environment and we saw parents with kids that in our minds were not treating their kids the right way, we would just become it affected. I would say angry is probably the best word. Angry that maybe we couldn't have kids and they could. We would treat our kids better than that. You know that. And again, we're not believers, so there's no framework for any of that.
Sure.
Scheduled the surgery. Well, Nancy was going in the night before, and so we had the pre-op conference with Dr. Hendy, who came into the room. And we had to sign all of these forms. Todd, he didn't know what he was going to have to do. We were basically giving him permission to take Nancy's entire reproductive system if he needed to.
Just to get in there and do whatever.
We were signing away. I mean, even all these years later, man, I just think about that moment. We were signing away our rights to be parents. Now, God is in our lives. We're not cognizant of his presence in our lives. He's there, providentially, sovereignly, already working, the common grace of God working in a person's life before they come to believe, And so we signed those forms and we cried our eyes out. And I went home and left Nancy there that night. And I went home that night, Todd, and I put my head on the pillow. And here's what came out. Hey, God, been a while since we talked. I know you're there. I know you care. I know you love some people. I'm not sure you love me. And I know you could. I don't know if you're willing, but you could heal Nancy. And if you're willing, and if you do that, I'd give you the rest of my life. Now, that's a classic 911. I mean, let's pick up the phone and let's dial the heavenly 911 number. I mean, who hasn't done that somewhere along the way? The next day, it was supposed to be an hour and a half. It was 3 hours and 45 minutes, and I hadn't heard anything. I had my brother and my college roommate. My college roommate, who to this day is a great friend. He was him and his girlfriend. He never married. He didn't marry her. He married somebody else. But him and his girlfriend that set me up with the date with Nancy. He was there in the waiting room with me.
Wow.
Dr. Hendy comes walking down the hallway. I got up out of my chair and ran to meet him. I said, Doc, how are we doing back there? And he said, we're wrapping up right now. He said, I'm going to give you a chance to see her on the way from OR to recovery. He said, a couple of things. She's very pale, Jim. Don't get scared. She says she's fine, but she lost a lot of blood. We've replaced it. She's going to be fine, but she is white as a sheet. So don't be scared. She's okay. And he said, we're not going to have it. Let's stay in there long. And I said, okay. I said, but how did it turn out in there? He said, here's the other part. He said, Nancy, I remember these words. It's exactly what he said to me, Todd. Nancy still has everything she was born with. Those are the words he used with me.
Wow.
That's fine. What happened, Doc? He said, well, the reason it took so long is that it's all isolated. And I could see it all when I got in there. And he said, for reasons, listen to this, Todd, for reasons that are not even clear to me right now, I decided to go ahead and remove all of those white growths that you saw on that screen. They're all gone.
Wow.
I said, you didn't do a hysterectomy? He said, probably would have been the easier solution. But I just thought if there was any way I could give you guys a chance, I wanted to do that.
Wow. Wow.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're sitting there with a tear running down.
Right? Now, he did say, I'm not saying you can have children. No. I don't, because there's extensive scarring in there from what I've done. But I've at least left over the possibility. And I was like, yeah, thank you. So Nancy gets home and starts healing up. And it's, 6 or 8 weeks later, it's January. And I said to Nancy, hey, so I haven't said anything about this. Let me tell you what happened that night when I left you at the hospital and went home. And I told her about my experience in praying that night. She said, I did almost the same thing. And I said, well, what do you think we ought to do with that? She said, well, we probably ought to find a church and maybe start going back to church. So we started going to a little church, not a little church, pretty good sized church near Norcross First United Methodist Church. And we started attending a Bible-believing, very Orthodox United Methodist Church, even to this day, very, very Orthodox. And at least a couple of times every month, they would have an altar call. I mean, their pastor at the time would have an altar call at the end of the service. And what they did back in the day was when you started attending, a couple of times, they would figure that out because you signed the attendance pad, right, Jim and Nancy? They gave you a big brother and a big sister who were going to kind of shepherd you through the process. Well, Mike and Star Scott, never forget them. They got us in their Sunday school class even before we became believers. And so we were being loved on and just, treated as if we were already members of the household of faith. We hadn't joined, but it was Palm Sunday. So for Nancy and me, every Palm Sunday, even though it's not the same date on the calendar, it's the same day in our minds. Every Palm Sunday, that Palm Sunday, 1983, Nancy and I, for the altar call that day, we got up out of our seats and we went down front and gave our lives to Christ, right? And everything's been different since then. So death of my father in 1973, that moment in Dr. Hendy's office, which then leads to this moment at the altar in 1983. Those are flip scripters, man.
Wow.
The whole flip script for our life flipped then and hasn't been the same.
Out of curiosity, just the details. So how much longer till, because you have 2 girls, is that correct?
Right.
So
right.
Just give me a quick.
Yeah, we do kind of need to close the loop on that because I've left you hanging. Well,
yeah,
I've got
now.
Kids, but they don't know that. Everybody listening here. So in late spring, early summer, after she'd been to a checkup, Dr. Hendy said, hey, look, I think you guys are in good shape here. He said, the scarring there is some scarring. I don't know what's going to happen here, but as far as I'm concerned, if you guys want to, start trying to have kids, why don't you go ahead and do that?
Wow.
And so it was shortly after Labor Day. It was mid-September of that year. Nancy gets up one morning and she is so nauseous. And she's in there and we're laughing at each other and we're like, because she knows what it is. She's like, I think it's morning sickness. Right. And again, remember, this is back 1983. We didn't have quite the pregnancy test, the sophistication. Yeah. It was kind of hit and miss. They had them, but you didn't know whether they were right or not.
You had to see a bump before you really did.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly. But hers did show positive. And then, of course, she was sick of the dog. So we're just like, yeah, there it is. So in June of 1984, our first daughter was born. And Todd, everybody's kids are special. You got kids. You know how special your kids are. But for us, that was the fulfillment of just God's tangible presence in our life, answering a most unworthy prayer, a very unworthy prayer that we had, which, by the way, all of our prayers are unworthy. There's one of the old liturgies that leads up to communion that says, and I love this. I think it came out of an Anglican or maybe a Catholic tradition. We are not worthy, so, O Lord, so as to pick up the crumbs under your table, right? And that's really, and so when we come to God and think, but for us, we're still trying to think you got to be a good person to come to God and pray. And so we're just thinking our unworthy prayers have resulted in this little work, this princess that we now have. And then almost 3 years later, our second one was born. So our kids are very, very special to us. They're part of, kind of the stones that God's put in our life to remember what I did for you. Remember what I did for you. Yeah, that's by the way, my girls and their husbands have heard this story very specifically because we want these stones to live on in our family.
No, it's beautiful because what a great way to start a family where you realize they're your gift from God. And so it just changes the way you parent. It changes the way it really, I can see how it changed your life.
Changes everything, man.
Changes everything. Okay. So Jim, thank you for all that. So I'm going to skip your accounting career and we're going to jump into what you do. And then we're going to go backwards because I do want to hear the journey of how you got from accounting to your life ministry is what I'm going to call it. But let's talk about, I want people listening to sort of know what you do for a living, but I'm going to set the table. So let's talk about churches in general and giving. So I'm sure you know so many stats, it always amazes me. But what percentage of people who sit in a church pew actually give to the church? It's a fraction of what most people would think.
Yeah. I would say for me, Todd, it's somewhere between a third and a half. Okay. Probably closer to a third. I mean, it's hard to get really meaningful information because you're talking about of the givers and of the people who actually come on a regular basis, which is, hard enough information pre-COVID. It's really hard to figure out now. But, I've looked at enough church databases. I think that's a pretty good answer. I'd be really comfortable with 40%.
Okay.
Plus or minus. Some do better, some do worse, but I'd be really comfortable with 40%.
In general. I'm going to set the table, and then you correct me if I don't frame this correctly. But here's the way I see it. So if we have Catholicism here and Protestant here, and one of the advantages of the hierarchy of the Catholic Church is accountability and teaching you know what I mean? And Protestant, we're over here and we have all these autonomous, we have denominations. We have a lot of, people can do what they want. They're a non-denominational church and they don't really have any accountability to anything, but they would say God and the scriptures, right? And you add that to the American Christianity model where the pastor is the CEO a lot of times, in a lot of denominations, not all, but a lot. Mm-hmm. And what you get is this phenomenon of if the pastor doesn't like talking about money, then money doesn't get talked about.
Yeah.
And no one's telling him to. And if he feels like asking is bad, and it's this attitude, and I see it a lot, I'm sure you do too. It's like, well, the Lord will fund what he wants to fund. And we don't even pass the plate anymore. We put giving boxes in the back and it becomes this culture of because of TV and radio, there's a lot of bad people asking for money. And so everybody's like, well, we don't want to be associated. And it creates this problem is the American Christian giver doesn't always give healthily or for the right reasons because they're not being taught about it. And they're not being taught about it because the pastor may or may not want to talk about it. And it creates this giant problem, which I think leads to why only half or less than half of the people get. Would you agree or you want to add to that?
Yeah. And I think, and really kind of what happens as a result of all of that, Todd, is that, and this is what I've seen, 29 years I've been out here. This September will be my 29th anniversary being out here doing this, is that, most pastors and most churches this is what they want to do, feel like God's called them to do, God's vision for your church, if you want to put it there. And here's the resourcing they have. So there's this massive gap between what God's called you to and what you think are your resources. And my whole point to most of these leaders is, do you think God would call you to this and not give you the resources to do that? And if you don't have the resources, then are you part of the problem or is God part of the problem, right? Yeah. Okay. What I see out there, if I had to just put it into two very broad categories, and there's lots of subcategories, two very broad ones. One of them would be biblical illiteracy. Our people don't know. Now, they may even know the Bible, but they don't know what the Bible says about money and possessions. And it gets so mixed up, Todd, that people actually believe that the primary reason that they give is to fund their church. That has nothing to do with why you give, frankly. That's the outgrowth. That's the impact of what happens when you give. Our giving is designed to be an encounter with God over the one thing that probably tempts us to worship it more than him, and that's our money and possessions. I know there are other things, but that's the one that I think and I think because I would say that because it's the one thing in the Bible and all of Jesus's teaching, the red letters. That's why I've got a red letter Bible. It's really easy for me to zero in. He said that, not somebody else said that. He said that when he said you can't worship two masters, and he called one of them God and one of them mammon. Mammon is a spiritual term for money and possessions, right? And so we miss it when we think that our relationship with money is financial. Our relationship with money is spiritual. It tempts us to worship at that altar rather than at the altar of the one true God. Deuteronomy 14:22-24, when God's talking about the collection of the tithe, he's talking about, and here's how we collect it. But then there's a comma, and he finishes out and says, and here's why we give. My belief, this is why we give, that you might revere the name of the Lord your God always. That's why we give. It's not so that my church can get funded. My church gets funded as a result of my understanding that's where we get it wrong. So biblical illiteracy, and then what I call vision ignorance. We're not aware of the vision of what my church intends to do out in the community and beyond, and then what happens when they do that. So even if my church is on point with its vision and winning big time out here, whatever that looks like as a win, we don't tell the stories, man. We don't tell the story. So even if we have people who get spiritually developed, they've gotten over the biblical illiteracy, they become spiritually developed givers, they do their primary giving somewhere other than the church. I'm not going to say to you, you have to do all of your giving in the church, but I would say, I think the Bible is pretty clear. It's your first place. Yeah. Whether you believe all the tithe belongs there or some portion of the tithe. I mean, we all got room for disagreement. I've got my beliefs on that, but I think you have to start with the idea that even before you start to give to all these other kingdom enterprises that God has allowed to flourish in the world, it starts with giving in your church. And if we, the church, are not telling great stories and promoting the impact of what happens, we've left you in ignorance. Yeah. That's on us. And so it's the biblical illiteracy and the vision ignorance, because I think that is the two pillars of how you develop great giving over the years. You have to have financial discipleship, and you have to have vision and impact. If you have all vision and impact, but no spiritual development, then all you got is fundraising, brother. Yeah. And I'm all in favor of some fundraising if your name is Wheaton College, right? But not if your name is Wheaton Bible Church, right? Yeah. And and then the other side is if you have all spiritual development and no vision and impact, you develop spiritual givers who give to all kinds of things other than the church.
Other than the church, that's right.
Right.
So do you feel... It's really interesting because I think you and I both have the same dilemma because we're in the same industry, if you will. I mean, like I focus digital, you focus on the church, but I feel like fundraising is a dirty word, and with me, digital strategy sometimes is a dirty word with the church because they're like, well, we don't need strategy, we're the church, and we don't fundraise. But but I guess when people hear your heart is when they flip. Like, you just sort of almost have to get in a room. Like, how do you break through? Because there's such what I would call a stiff arm from pastors who think, oh, we don't do that. We're not a gimmicky church. We're just going to rely on the Lord. Like, how do you break that barrier?
Yeah. Well, I think, Todd, we have to begin to confront this idea that faith and strategy are mutually exclusive. They're not. I think they walk they walk down the road, maybe on different sides of the road, but there's lots of places where faith and strategy converge. I think if you just look at, especially if you look at the book of Acts, the early church was strategic. They had deep faith, but they had strategy. Paul was always thinking, man, look at the place. He said, we wanted to go over into Asia Minor, but the door was closed. So we did this other thing. Is that not strategy? No, we wanted to go in Asia Minor and the door was closed. We're just going to rely on the Lord and just break that door down. No, that's not what he did. He had a different strategy. He said, it must be the Lord has something in mind. So let's go over here and plan what we're going to do here. And so, there's plenty of places. I go to lots of places, but to me, I think the big idea is this, and I say this to church leaders all the time who want to say to me, hey, Jim, I get all this strategy and all this process that you think you're doing, and I get all that. And it's like, but we're just going to rely on the Lord. And I was like, hey, why don't we talk about this? There's a verse, and it's one of my verses that I use a lot because I don't want people to believe that our process is what drives the result at the end of this. And it's from, one of Paul's quotes. He said, "I planted, Apollos watered, and God granted the increase." So, Pastor, when we come in and bring a strategy for you to develop stewardship and generosity in your flock, there's process and there's this and there's, but we don't think that's what does it. We just think it puts your people in a position where God can come in and grant the increase. We ascribe all of it to him. We're just doing kind of our part. And then they'll want to say to me, "Well, I don't know if you need that for God to grant the increase." I said, "Well, then maybe we don't need prayer to heal people."
Well, it's funny you say that. I'm going to pull my verse. I'm going to pull my verse in because it fits this exact same thing. It's the one that says, we prepare the horse for battle, but the battle's the Lord's. Well,
exactly.
The battle's the Lord. God actually, if you go back and look in the Old Testament, the Israelites won wars where they didn't have to pick up a sword, but they also won a bunch where they did. So you have to prepare the horse for battle. The battle's the Lord's. God can make you win or lose it. But we can't just wait for a lottery ticket to blow against the window. It doesn't work that way. We have to have a strategy to prepare the horse for battle. It's the same thing.
And in your world, in your world, for me, it's just like anybody who doesn't see we're going through a transformation here in society where we're moving from, and it's happened years ago. We moved from an agrarian economy to using cash way back when. That predates me. I know it's hard to believe that predates me. That's a good place to laugh. But and then there was this time back when it was all cash. And again, this predates me when people were saying, "Wait a second, this guy brought this thing in here that says pay to the order of, my church, and he signed his name to it, and it says $1,000. Am I supposed to take that? Can you give that as a tithe and offering?" I'm sure that was a controversy back in the day.
Sure.
Right. And there was an adaptation. Well, in mine and your lifetime, there's never been any pushback against accepting checks in the church. Right. We're just moving into a different methodology. And what you're doing is your work is you're helping churches to get better at that because it's not their native language. They don't know that. And they need help to go into that land. And so when you're doing strategy over there, I see it the same thing is that you're just helping them to put their people in a position where they can have that encounter with God, though not by putting a check in the plate.
Yeah. No, I like the way you said that. The thing I get frustrated, I'm going to use the word frustrating, I think that's right, is when people, and I would even say pastors with churches say, we're just going to trust the Lord with this, and we don't see a reason to ask. And I was like, what about Paul's second missionary journey? Like, he literally was collecting money for the church back in Jerusalem because they're in a drought, and he was walking around collecting money. He was asking them for a gift above and beyond their local church to fund ministry. It's like, well, if Paul did it, does that not count? It feels pretty biblical to me.
Ought to tell you something. It ought to tell you something, man. I'm sorry, and the crazy thing is sometimes we use examples out of context just to prove a point because we've already decided what we want the point to be.
Right.
And that's what I try to help pastors and church leaders understand is, hey, look, I want your church to get all the funding it needs, but let's start by developing your people. Let's not shoot at, let's not pull the bow back and shoot at people's wallets. Let's aim it at their hearts. Yeah. And then once we get their hearts transformed, here's what I can tell you. You're more likely to see full funding of the vision God's given you than if we just start shooting at their wallets. Right. And that's a lot of times they don't think it's a counterintuitive way to get there. It's not manipulation. We're not kind of, trying to bait and switch. It's just our relationship with money is spiritual. It's not financial. As much as we think it's financial, it's a spiritual relationship. And so that's where we have to find all the answers. And when we find them there, then that's good. Even digital strategy, Todd, until you change people's hearts around that whole thing, they're never going to go online and do a gift or do a recurring gift or whatever they do. You know that. You've seen it happen.
No, it's true. Well, this is why you're on this podcast today, is because after meeting you and after being involved with Generis, I noticed how many pastors you guys have, ex-pastors, if you will. I hate that term, ex-pastors, because I think what you are, you always are. But
you always are. Just a different line of work.
It's a different line of work. But you have a lot of ex-pastors, and I thought, why is that? And then when I hear you talk, and I hear the things like you just said, it's a reminder to me. is you're not, yes, you know tactics and yes, you know strategies because you're a smart man, but y'all really do have the organization does, and you specifically, which is why you're here. I feel like you are passionate about this ministry to teach people about money because the churches aren't doing it, and it results in more giving, but you're not aiming at the gift. You really are trying to change culture within churches.
That's all we're trying to do, Todd. It doesn't happen so much anymore. It still does happen from time to time, but there were times over the years when we get people that they're just in a financial panic, and it was like, they're dialing up and they're calling us, hey, and what they're basically looking for, I'll use this kind of my generic term, 30 ways to raise $300,000 in 30 days. And I'm just like, that's not what we do, guys. I mean, you can go get, Google's got that. Go get that off the internet somewhere and just follow whatever they're going to. That's not what we're doing. That's what you're talking about is a quick flame up, kind of like, when you and I've got I don't do it anymore, but, you got the briquettes on the grill and the wife is in the house. Hey, is that grill ready yet? And you go get the lighter fluid and squirt it on there. Who hasn't done that? We've all done that. It produces a lot of flame in the moment, but then it goes away.
Right.
That's what those strategies are. They don't produce any long-term good. And in fact, what they do is they work against you because you're teaching your people to give to a financial need, not to a transformed heart.
Yeah. Amen.
Right. And they're working against us. What we want to do is to go back and use the same analogy. We want to go out back and we want to find some good hardwood trees, that kind of wood that it takes a little while to get it started. But once you get it started, I mean, who hadn't had a great fire with some nice, fresh, seasoned oak that you get it started and it just seemed to burn on forever? Yeah. That's what we're trying to do here, is to shift your culture, not just change how much money's coming in.
Amen. And to keep that analogy going, my steak has been done and I look at that fire and you know what I do? I sometimes go back to the refrigerator and say, what else can I cook? That fire's great. And I've seen that happen with churches.
I've done that, man. I've done that.
They need this much money. They're getting this much. Like, what else can we go do? Because
that's right. That's a good analogy too. I love that.
Yeah, just keep cooking.
I love that.
Okay, so I want some stories from you because, and here's how I'm going to set the table. Is one thing I loved about when we have our Generis meetings is these stories of pastors who may have been reluctant at first, like, okay, we'll hire them because we need this thing. And then you coach them. And on the other side, they are actually thankful and say, thank you for causing me to work a muscle I didn't want to work. And it needed work. And now I see things way different than I saw before, because you're really in a pastor and leadership transformation business so that they can go transform their own churches.
That's right.
But I'm assuming that's the story, right? Isn't that your goal? Change his heart, right?
I think for me, Todd, what I could say is over the years, I have spent a lot more time than I would have thought I would have spent way back when I started. A lot more time behind closed doors with pastors, just helping them deal with their issues with money. That's the big limiting factor, is most of the time when you find a pastor who in a teaching environment has difficulty with this topic, you can usually trace it to their own personal issue with the topic. Now, I'm not trying to expose them out in a group format. So that's why, you kind of know, I've shared this inside of our team sessions. I always, every time I go in to meet with a client, I always have an hour to 2 hours with just me and the pastor, door closed, off the record, just talking. So I remember this would be 1998, but it was a very, very transformative experience. This is a guy who was a pastor in a church in the Dallas area. He was so good at preaching, Todd. He was just so good. But we cranked up the capital campaign and he was starting his sermon series. That first sermon, I was there for that Sunday. He was just awful. I could say not very good. He was awful.
Okay.
And he was awful because it was obvious to me that he was uncomfortable. I used the words with him that day. He said, how did I do today? And I said, I'm confused. And he said, what do you mean? I said, I've heard you teach. I've heard you preach a number of times. You're as good as anybody I've heard in a while. But not today. there's something about this topic that's bothering me. I said, it felt to me like, this is the words I used with him. I said, it felt to me like you were a cat doing a dance on a hot tin roof. Mm-hmm. And he stopped. And he said, the problem's me. Okay, let's talk about that. So he began to talk about, he and I went to lunch and we just sat and talked. And he talked about his family history. His dad was a pastor. And he had a perception from way back when his dad preached a sermon and 2 weeks later he was released by the church and they had to move. In his mind, it was that sermon that he preached on money that caused him to have to move.
So
I said,
wow.
Do you know that's true? And he said, well, I'm assuming it's true. I said, no, do you know that's true? Your dad's not alive. No, he's not. Is your mom still alive? No. You have any siblings? Yeah, I've got an older sister. Why don't you talk to her and see what her recollection of that was? Yeah. I said, because I just wonder whether that's really, if that's what's got you. I said, basically, Pastor, you're in a self-constructed prison and you're holding the key. Mm-hmm. I said, so I think if we're going to get you any better on this topic, we got to get you out of that jail. Well, he talked to his sister. And so it was like Thursday of that week. He called me. He's like, you're not going to believe this. I said, what? He said, I talked to my sister. He said, that sermon had nothing to do with Dad getting moved. And I said, wow. Yeah. He said, she just said, Paul, there were all kinds of other issues going on. She said, Dad was just hanging on by a thread. That sermon had nothing to do with him leaving. And so think about it, Todd. This guy is like 25 years into the ministry, and he's been in jail on this topic over something that never really happened.
Yeah.
Now, that's an extreme example.
Yeah, no, I get it.
By the way, just to finish the story, the next Sunday, you want to take some, and the Sunday after that, you want to take any guests? He was a lot better.
You nailed it.
He was just that quickly, he was freed on the topic because he realized the thing that he believed all of his life about preaching about money in the church, that's what caused his dad to get moved. That was not even true. And it freed him up. He had a key. He opened the door and he's out of jail, man.
Isn't that great? I find it ironic because I know some pastors that fit in this category. They would look at you in the eye and say they can't believe people don't teach the full gospel and that people avoid tough verses and whatever. I'm like, you're avoiding one that's not one verse. It's in hundreds of verses. It's money. And how God sees money and how you should see money. It's a topic, and people are avoiding it like the plague.
Yeah, I love Tim Keller says this about it. He did a talk in front of Generis Giving some years ago, 8 or 9, maybe 10 years ago now. The original version's out on YouTube. It was a great 15-minute talk. But in it, he covers this point, and I love this point. He said, so back in the day when it was early on, and I did lots of counseling with people. He said, I don't anymore, but we found some people that are a lot better at it than I am. But he said, I did a lot of it back in the day. He said, no one, not one person. He said, people came in and they sat on my couch and they would confess the deepest, darkest, ugliest things in their life. Family history, current sins, affairs, drug addiction. He said, you name it. You're like, but never, not once did someone come in and sit on my couch and say, hey, Pastor, I think I have this problem with money. Not once. He said, now, let's hold that over here. Jesus, on the other hand, spent an inordinate amount of his time talking about that above other things. He said he really didn't need to say a lot about adultery because it's kind of, if you're in that sin, and lying and other things. He said, but with money, he said, so let's hold it this. He said, if Jesus talked about that 10 to 20 times more than the other topics he chose to speak about in his 3-year ministry, and nobody thinks it's them, and then he just kind of does one of these, what does that say to us? I mean, I think that's to what you're right there to what you're saying. I said, I don't know of a better way to explain Jesus' perspective on it and our perspective on it. They couldn't be any different.
Wow. Okay, so here's my question. I think now people understand more about your heart and what your life mission, if you will, your career has become this. But let's go back. You're starting your family. You're an accountant. How did Jim get from there to what you're doing now? Like what opportunities what whys in the road did you take to get here?
Yeah, so there's 2 or 3 things that happened in there, Todd. One of them was that, so if Nancy and I became Christians in 1983, we started becoming Generis Christians in 1985.
Okay.
And in May of 1987, for the first time in our lives, a lot longer journey, longer story, no need to go into all the details there, but we started a plan. We wanted to get from where we were, less than 2% of our income, to become tithers. That was fall of 85. And in May of 1987, a lot sooner than we thought it could happen, on May 1st or the first Sunday in May of 1987, we wrote a check to the church. For the first time in our lives, it represented 10% of our income for that month. And we've never looked back. Our whole journey has been, so God was developing a stewardship story, a generosity story in our lives way back when. So that's number one. Number two, 2 years after, so roughly 1985, not related to the journey of our journey of stewardship, but 1985, we left Norcross First United Methodist Church, and we left to redevelop a church up here in North Fulton, which was developing very rapidly. It ended up being a church plant because the church that we were trying to redevelop just absolutely died right in front of us. Not for reasons of us getting there, because it was an unhealthy church before we got there. And then we ended up basically planting a church right here, a church right down the road, Johns Creek United Methodist Church. Nancy and I were one of the 8 founding families there. So what happened there was, as a layperson, I wasn't on staff, but other than being the senior pastor of the church, Todd, I served in almost every role at some point in time in planning that church. I got a view of church life that was just, hardly anyone ever gets that view.
Right.
And so this God is developing this story of generosity and stewardship. We're involved in planting a church. Now, I'm very successful. I've moved on, and I'm now at another company, a financial services company. I'm senior vice president and CFO there, of a publicly held, very successful financial services company. So my business career is going great. But move the faith forward in 1992, our company got sold. And so I knew that some things were going to change. I thought I'd just, stay around. But in June of that year, rather than being reorganized into another role, I was reorganized off the organization chart, right? So now I've got to figure out what I'm going to do. Well, that goes back about 6 months earlier, because I had felt in late 1991, I'd been to a men's retreat, thought that maybe I'd been called to be an ordained pastor. So God maybe is calling me out of a very successful business career to go to seminary. I spent 7 weeks. This is a much longer story than you've got time for on your podcast, but 7 weeks in front of God asking him, what do you want me to do with my life? And I got 0 answers until right before Christmas of 1991. And God said, be still, be still. And so for me, and I've got some wise counsel, some people that are speaking into my life, including my pastor, the one that we planted the church with, who are just saying, be still means don't make any rash decision right now. Let's wait on God to move and see what his move is. Well, 6 months later, his move was, I want you out of corporate world. And easy to see now. I mean, Frank, that day, Todd, I felt like I'd taken a Muhammad Ali right cross to the face, but I didn't see that coming.
Yeah.
But again, it's another one of those, pivotal times in my life when God's reauthoring what he wants to do with my life. So think of this. I've got a very successful business career. I understand finance very, very well. I'm a CPA, CFO of a publicly held company. I understand finance. I've been involved in a church, what essentially was a church plant. I've done almost everything there. And I'm still leading at that church. And then God's authoring this story of stewardship and generosity in mine and Nancy's lives. And all of that converged in September of 1992, and I ended up here.
Wow.
Now, for me, you've heard me say this before, I was just doing what I thought was the one step God wanted me to take at the time.
Yeah.
What I now realize has happened was God was authoring this is my life's work now. I came here out of a step of just that's what I was supposed to do in September of 1992. But this is my life's work. This is what he spoke to me at that men's retreat in 1991 and what he wanted me to do all along. The providential sovereign hand of God always kind of guiding it. And bro, look, for the people who are listening, I am so terrible at following God. I'm a lot better at leading ahead and asking him to come up and bless what I've done, the mess I've created, right? So I don't want anybody to get the wrong impression. talking about these things all these years later, I can see God's hand and I can describe it this way, but it was hard at the time because I was getting in the way and, my obstinance and, my pride and all the other things. So I don't want to create any wrong impression, but it's a clear story of God working in my life, and then keeping Nancy and me together for 42 years. We've got a long, very prosperous marriage. We not only love each other, we like each other. We know some families that have been married that long and they love each other. We don't question that. We're like, I'm not sure if y'all like each other. They're always ornery with each other and stuff.
Well, no, I love this story because once again, I feel I know you well enough to know this is ministry to you. This is not, You're not out trying to make a buck and tell people how to make a buck. Like, this is a passion of yours and you're really good at it. And your goal is to pour into pastors and change their hearts and people's hearts about how they see money, which may result in more funding of the church and all the mission work the church should be doing. And I like how you said, and maybe their vision is limited. It's like, oh, here's what we would do if we had enough money, but we only have this much money, so we only have this much staff, this much ministry.
Exactly right.
Well, what if you're telling you God, I do believe God funds what he wants. I totally believe it, which is the issue, is that you can't say, well, this is how much we made. One of the little sayings I'd say is like, when people don't like digital strategy because it feels yucky to them, I'm like, okay, do you know that plate you pass through people down the aisles? Take that plate and go stick it out in the middle of the highway and see if it fills up. Mm-hmm. It doesn't. You're using strategy just by running it down the road. I said, and online, there's strategy where you do that too. It's not dirty.
I'm with you. 100%.
Okay, so as we wrap this up, I want to ask you two big questions. One is, I love the moments. You've identified the moments, but what would you say that your financial background has been a skill that has played you well in your life of ministry here? Is it the theology of you learning about money? Like, tell me what else might be a skill set that you believe like God prepped in you and put in you that makes you good at what you do right now?
Well, I think it's that journey that he started authoring in our lives back in 1985. So he planted this inside of it. By the way, both of us are givers, so there's no check in our house, in terms of one person speaking and so, we want to be careful with that. Nancy and I are both, he's put two givers in the same household. Doesn't always do this. Sometimes he puts two savers in a household or two spenders in a household or whatever. Sometimes he puts a saver and a spender in a household, but in this case, he put two givers in the same household. So that journey. So there is something about the theology and the teaching. A lot of it is just experiential for me. I can show you the reference points in scripture, but I a lot of times just talk about my journey. Hey, it wasn't easy for me. When I first took stock of it in 1985, I was given less than 2%, but I knew that we wanted to get to hopefully, 10%. We set out a pathway to do that. So the theology matters, but the financial side matters as well, because what I'm able to see over here is I can see when churches are either in or headed toward an unhealthy situation, right? So for me, I always define financial margin as green light, yellow light, red light. People will say things like, well, Jim, how much should we borrow from the bank? And I just say, well, you shouldn't borrow any more than you feel comfortable with. Well, that's not a very good answer. So, and then I can show them maybe some guidelines on what that looks like. I sit in rooms sometimes, Todd, and I'm sitting in rooms full of lay people and they're talking about a building or, a big capital project. And I'm thinking, okay, here's what your income is. Here's what you're likely to be able to raise from a capital campaign. Here's how much you owe the bank right now. Here's how much additional you may buy. And I'm just doing the math in my head and I've already figured out you can't afford this building.
Right. Wow.
But I can't say that in the room, because if I say that in the room, then I'm just the bad guy. What I've got to do is I've got to plant seeds for them. And so I'll do something like, this is kind of my favorite tactic. Won't surprise you. Like, hey, wait a second, guys. There's a lot of numbers flying around in the room here. And, I'm not the sharpest crayon here. I'm from Georgia, so that has limitations. So can I just go up here and put all these numbers on the board?
Yeah.
And Todd, probably I don't have statistics, but I'm going to tell you 7, 8, maybe even 9 times out of 10. All I have to do is put the numbers on the board and somebody's like, hey, Pastor, do you think we can afford this? And I'm sitting over thinking, Nope, I didn't say a word.
Right,
If there was a bubble above my head, it'd be, thank you, somebody finally figured this out. But what I'm doing is I'm helping them see that their reality is not what they think it is, right?
Yeah.
And so rather than me being the prophet in the room, if I just go in and say, hey, guys, you can't afford this, and I put the numbers on the board, as soon as I walk out, I'm the bad guy, and they're going to go back and like, well, hey, his opinion, he's from Georgia. What is it matter
And
what
their
he
defense
thinks, right?
mechanism kick in.
And so that's been a real skill of mine over the years that comes from my financial background is, when I see financial statements, I understand what's going on right away. And I don't always tout that. It's like, hey, y'all know I'm a former CPA and a CFO of a $200 million company, right?
Right.
I do sort of know what's going on here. I don't tout that. It's in the back of my mind because I always look at their financials. Yeah. And so I've already figured out what you can. And so maybe what I'll say is, the pastor will call me and say, hey, Jim, I felt like you had a point to make in that meeting. Yeah, let's you and I talk offline. Let's get in your office. And I'll say, I just feel like you're moving into the yellow zone and maybe headed toward the red zone. And I don't want to see you do that. Right. And so that's been helpful for me over the years.
No, I can imagine. You know how to look at a spreadsheet a lot differently. I was on an elder board and I have zero. I was an English major, right? I mean, I don't know how to look at numbers. And that's got to be super advantageous to have a guy who is. The phrase I love to use is I attribute it to Chuck Swindoll. I'm not even sure he originated it, but I know he has it on his desk. Thoughts disentangle themselves over the lips and through the fingertips. And so just getting in a room and talking or writing, all those things become evident. You write it on the board, now you can see it. But when it's in your head, it's just jumbled, right? Wow. Okay, I as we wrap up, here's my last question. I know you're an avid reader, and I don't think I've ever been in a room with you where you haven't told, here's a book you need to read. So based on the conversation we have, if anybody's listening and they go to church and they feel like they're, what books would you recommend anybody listening to read? And what are your top 3 or 4 you leave on your shelf?
Well, I think there's a couple of them that I really like, Todd. For me, I think the requisite piece that everyone should read about, this whole idea of stewardship and money is Randy Alcorn, Money, Possessions, and Eternity. Okay. And it's a great book. Now, it's not a quick read, but it's a very challenging read. It's theologically sound. It has, to me, I think, lots of good stuff in there that are reference points that anybody can dive in and get something. It'd probably take you a while to work through it. I mean, my version has lots of notes written in it, right? Yeah. And, I think that there's, I think Your Money Counts by Howard Dayton. I like Dayton's work. He was one of the founding members of Crown Financial Ministries. I think he does a great job in there and talking about that. A couple of guys from Ivy League schools. This is a really good book. It's off the radar screen. It's called True Riches, What Jesus Really Said About Money and Your Heart. It's John Cortines, Cortines, and Gregory Baumer, Baumer. I think it's a fantastic read. I don't agree with 100% of what they wrote in there. I don't know that I agree with 100% of anything because we all have kind of our own shape. But I agree with 80 to 90%. It's a phenomenal. It's about, a topic I know pretty well. Money, possessions, and eternity. It calls me to think about that topic differently.
So, Jim, what about your book, Contagious Generosity? Yeah,
Contagious Generosity would be one I'd throw in there, not as a shameless plug, but really Chris Fuller and I wrote that because we're keen observers of church life. Both of us have been involved in it very, very actively over a long period of time. And there were 10 things that we saw that we thought tripped up churches regularly. And that's why we sought to write that book, was just to flag these things. For example, you said something earlier, Todd, about, pastors having a hard time of asking. And so one of our chapters is just devoted to this idea of what if asking was reframed as ministry? What if you thought about asking as ministry? Jim, I'm ministering to you by asking you to be involved in something that God is doing here, right? Right. The idea that, Pastor, you have to take the lead. Your voice is the biggest voice here. The idea that the offering moment matters and you probably aren't spending enough time with that, things like that. So, yeah, I'd love to throw our book in there as just kind of a different view than the others, but a real good view of church life and some things that we thought. We wrote it 8 or 9 years ago, over 9 years ago now. But I would still say everything in there almost exactly the same way, probably just change the illustrations a little bit.
Love it. All right, brother. Thank you so much.
Hey, man, thanks for having me on the podcast, Todd. It was great being here with you today. I've loved it. It's a lot of fun.
I love getting to know you. And do you mind if I pray for you here right when we wrap up?
That'd be a good thing, brother. I'd appreciate that.
Let's do that. God, you are an awesome Father, Lord, full of good gifts, grace, mercy, and love. Lord, we are grateful to know that you and only you are in control of all things. Lord, thank you for Jim, how you have uniquely made him and have walked beside him and before him, helped shaping him to the man, father, CEO, the counselor that he is today. Lord, we thank you for the grace you've shown him. We thank you for making him a man committed to helping others fulfill their God-sized mission. Lord, I ask you to continue blessing Jim and Generis. Lord, we ask that you grow his ministry reach, not for personal financial gain, but that your son's name may be glorified around the globe. Lord, may Jim continue to pour into pastors' lives and churches and minister to them and teach them what your word says about money. Show yourself mightily as you use Jim to expose your truth in churches where safe teaching and offending people is the new norm, Lord. Lord, we love you, and we thank you for first loving us, and it's in your precious son's name we pray.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of This Is His Story podcast.
Overwhelmed at all the technical terms, trends, options, cost, invoice signings for your organization's digital strategies? Join other leaders of Christian organizations as we join hands in our closed Facebook group. Go to creativedigitalguide.com/Facebook to register and apply for access. I'm only allowing executives of Christian organizations in. No vendors, no high-pressure sales, no gimmicks into this closed Facebook group. Sign up today and be encouraged and informed as you lead your Christian organization. Looking for a free resource to help your organization move the needle on new names and donors? Watch the 5 simple shifts to gain dedicated donors with your digital strategies webinar. Go to creativedigitalguide.com to register for this on-demand resource built exclusively for executive directors. creativedigitalguide.com for more information of gaining donors and telling stories that convert to new names and donations. Fund your God-sized mission.